Hello everyone, this is Patrick from EDU8106, and in this video I'll be sharing me and my team's thinking on pragmatism, particularly the epistemological genealogy from a Western perspective at least, and the difference between the common sense meaning of the word or the term, or small p pragmatism, and the philosophical connotations and historical baggage of the term, or big P pragmatism, and how this idea has progressed through time from a philosophical point of view, Western philosophical point of view, and where it might be going, and how it's relevant to education practice and education inquiry and research. Okay, so I have a relatively large, complicated diagram here. So I'm going to break this up, explain my logic in here, our logic, by zooming into different parts. So to begin with, I have this sort of nucleus here, these two nuclei rather of little p and big P pragmatism. And so together I would say the words are both concerned with concepts and meaning and practice around truth, validity, ethics, and morality. But I would say in practice, they have very different meanings, or rather the meanings are different depending on where you are and how you're using it. Sort of, are you talking to colleagues about everyday work, or are you actually talking about the epistemologies of research and logic? So I would say that in the small p pragmatism, I encounter this every week, even from colleagues and professors and relatively high-ranking people in research, even at the University of Ottawa, when they use the word pragmatic or pragmatism. And when they say that, they often mean relative to the individual's needs or purposes, or relative to the individual's organization or the task at hand. So getting stuff done, like get whatever works to get it done. And then you have the big P sense, and I think this is an important, subtle but important difference, in that truth, validity, ethics, and morality in big P pragmatism is relative to the context of the situation and its constituting relationships, and of course including what the purpose, like what the collective kind of goal is, both from being, meaning, and of course what, well, I would argue also what is right and wrong, or what should and should not be done, although that part is a bit murkier, which I'll get to later. So expanding on the big P, if we move out, this section of my diagram describes the general, very briefly, the philosophical genealogy of this concept. So starting as a generally speaking, pragmatism can be, you can think of it as an epistemological term, so a way of thinking about thinking term, as the name of a method, principle, or maxim for clarifying concepts and hypotheses, and for identifying empty disputes. Now, what do I mean by empty disputes? Well, pragmatism actually emerged out of Western philosophy as a way of overcoming seemingly irreconcilable differences in perspective or argumentation in Western philosophy. So around 1907, a philosopher by the name of William James published a sort of a treatise on pragmatism as a new name for some old ways of thinking. So even back then, it was considered to be an old tradition, stemming back to classical philosophy. So from James's perspective, there were at the time, and probably he would, if he were still alive now, he'd probably still say the same thing, that in Western philosophy there are two fundamentally irreconciled, not necessarily irreconcilable, but at the time at least irreconciled, thought systems in philosophy and human inquiry underpinning most inquiry. The hard, or the empirical, so we must be able to see and sort of measure something for it to be true and as an answer to a question. And then the tender, or the moral, religious, and spiritual. And of course, this is probably a baggage of the Enlightenment and the separation between rational thinking and the being of the organism of the organic nature of experience. But he wanted to sort of get through this and say, well, if we think about pragmatically, ideas become true just insofar as they help us get into satisfactory relation with other parts of our experience. And that's an interesting perspective. It's already getting to this idea of plural truth. Truth can be plural, which is uh, you know part of a lot of different epistemological traditions now. Um, and so he was often, some people kind of cite him as the granddaddy of Western pragmatism, at least as modern pragmatism. But he wasn't the only one interested in this. And in fact, another philosopher and linguist, and who might be of interest to some of you, but Charles Peirce also kind of developed this, and he kind of pushed it a bit forward, made it even more pragmatic, in the sense that he argued that pragmatism is a tool for clarifying our ideas, not a means of determining truth. It's a means of clarifying. So it's useful in verbally deconstructing an argument to verify its merits. Sorry. And of course, Peirce, those of you who may be familiar with Peirce's work, Peirce is relatively famous for developing Peircean kind of semiotics after Saussure, sort of structural. It's very much a structural kind of perspective, structuralism. And so he developed what some people cite as the Peirce maxim, or the pragmatic maxim, that is, truth is the end of inquiry, and I would add, wherever that may be. Now, what this means is, from a epistemological point of view, is this is a quote that I got from his some of his 19th or 20th century writing, is to consider. So if you think of a problem or a situation or a phenomenon, so consider what effects, which might conceivably have practical bearings, we conceive the object of our conception to have, right? So what actual kind of qualities and things that we can actually kind of identify that are practical and tangible. Then our conception of those effects is the whole of our conception of the object. So in a sense, it doesn't matter if we, on some level, if we disagree with the irreducible quality of being, or what it is to be human, or whatever it is, the phenomenon we're looking at, or what language is even, what the difference between language and meaning, whatever. What matters is what we have in front of us, and if we're careful enough, we might realize that the difference between our understanding or our experiences with that object are not necessarily that different on some plane. And so this was seen as a way. So this is essentially a way to get through issues and kind of quarrels, or maybe twisted kind of irreconcilable kind of differences in meaning and understanding from different philosophical traditions and emerging experiences. So from a philosophical point of view, then it pretty much is a means of logic, of knowing. So this part here, and that's pretty much a way, that's the kind of primary purpose traditionally of pragmatics. But it is based on a certain kind of teleology, I would say, of starting with ontology, right? So Peirce is probably is particularly famous for developing the ontological or the aesthetic underpinnings of pragmatics, and this idea that perception is precognitive, yet truth is also from his point of view, truth is monistic, in the sense that if we start from perception, we all kind of have a shared kind of biological perception with the world, and so that's where that comes from, or that's where we start. And then ethics is layered on top. Ethics stems from that. And then on top of that, we have our ways of thinking, our ways of knowing and experiencing, or our ways of interpreting. Now, that's when truth can become diverged, right? Now, curiously, Peirce and James were not particularly interested in ethics, although they did acknowledge, and lots of other theorists at the time acknowledged, yes, this is part of it, but they were kind of busy with the logic. Okay, so they kind of said, and I would argue that they kind of went with, generally speaking, a sense of utilitarianism as an ethical framework, and I would say that now this is not, for the rest of pragmatics history, but at the time, and I would say that's actually how we got to little p pragmatism as actually having this sense of utilitarianism, right? The ends justify the means, or the few is least harm is it justifies whatever we're doing, um, or the sense that we can engage with adversaries even if we're diametrically opposed, but we have current interests that align. And it's really like the sense that we care about stuff that works, right? Getting the job done. Um, However, like that's not necessarily was the purpose of pragmatics. Although obviously getting through an argument obviously was a purpose. Um, but so this isn't necessarily the end of ethics, but it wasn't the primary interest of most pragmatics theorists. Now, getting into education, then this idea of truth, this maxim of truth as the end of inquiry, that actually had, and both Person and James actually had a big influence on John Dewey, and I would say that he is the sort of the primary vector of pragmatism in educational practice and epistemologies and theory. So Dewey, of course, was interested in the pragmatic dimensions of education as a civilizing kind of as a democratizing force in society. And so those of you who have a teaching background are probably familiar with inquiry-based learning, or research-led learning. And so in this tradition, ideally, the teacher begins by facilitating contact with some phenomenon which proves genuinely puzzling to the students, then guides them through a cycle of inquiry which, if all goes well, resolves the problematic situation to the satisfaction of all present. If the genuine indeterminacy of the problematic situation can be successfully navigated, the reward will be students who have learned not just how to know, but how to think. Now, that's interesting because it is a sense that truth can be plural. And of course, if you're interested in critical theory or critical pedagogy, that there is a tradition in that sense that we can all kind of arrive at a different truth, and that can be successful even if our students and as teachers, even if those truths are not necessarily monistic or homogeneous. Now, in practice, I would say this is probably not what necessarily happens, because then we get issues with parentism and such. But this is where pragmatism led, right? Because it's not about arriving at a specific truth or specific answer, but it's the process. And then it's learning that process, or not learning the process, but growing through that process that's important. Now, Dewey, just even current philosophers of education do sometimes argue that unfortunately Dewey is often seen as some sort of miraculous, sort of spontaneous, big bang of educational theory in Western society, and still everything kind of often revolves around Dewey or begins and ends with him. But there are other traditions, and I would say that currently the value of pragmatics is pretty open and is potentially an exciting area to explore epistemologically for inquiry and research and maybe even teaching, or maybe even both when teaching. So there are definitely contemporary epistemologies following or initiating new traditions that address or help develop under theorized dimensions of ethics in pragmatism. And if that's something you're interested in, I think that there's an interesting kind of opportunity there. There are also, of course, contemporary epistemologies following Peirce, and critical theory in education, particularly cultural studies in education, is a pragmatic tradition is a pragmatic tradition within critical theories, which is this is a good rejoinder to those of us who were present and engaged with the wonderful critical theory presentation from last week. But there's also constructivism and structuralism and functionalism. There's still lots of that happening. In fact, I could go on. I won't, but that's still a huge tradition in contemporary research design, but also teaching. Now, but then what we have down here are, I would argue, the pragmatics that are not necessarily named as such, but are amenable or could be reconciled or could be put into conversation with pragmatics, or pragmatism. So we have indigenous worldviews. So of course, for hopefully obvious reasons, an indigenous theorist is not going to name their ways of thinking as Western pragmatism, but there are definitely ways of knowing within indigenous traditions that could be understood through a pragmatic lens. There are, I would argue, 20th and 21st century materialisms, which are, and post-structuralisms in education and educational theory, which try to still struggle with that problem that William James had, which is, we have this sort of incredibly difficult to articulate physical experience in relationship with the world, but we also have our thinking, and how do we reconcile that from a philosophical point of view? And then those of you who are engaging with our extra readings this week, we also have queer theory, which is, I think, fundamental or inescapably pragmatic, because we're dealing with situations that are and experiences that are extremely heterogeneous, extremely divergent, both in the physical, in the ontological, but also in the the ethical and the thinking process, or the logical, right? Like the rational. And so I welcome everyone to hopefully read that article, because I think that also puts a really nice contemporary light on pragmatics and how it's relevant to the issues that are affecting the very difficult issues that are affecting education research and educators alike in our present moment. So thank you. That is my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing you all on Friday.